Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.
I'm not late, right? Just on time.
What?
We're just on time, right?
You know, I
How do
I
you
mean,
count to five, right?
I've come on at 6 p.m. every Saturday because that's more or less 45 minutes.
Okay. Well, it's going to get later. It's going to keep getting later. But either way,
I know.
let's see. Let's give it a couple minutes, see if anyone else joins.
Yeah, of course.
Where am I? Here we go.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.
Tov, James. Okay, I guess, there we go. Now we can get started. Spoke a minute too soon. I was going to give up on Hanan. But, so Shavua Tov, everyone. Today's daf is daf Lamed Hey 35 in Masechet Pesachim. And David got up to the Mishnah on the holiday yesterday. And we're going to start from there. Okay. So the Mishnah, we're up to a new sugya, which is exactly what grains and what foods are suitable for matzah. We're going to see in the Gemara today, and we're going to do much more tomorrow as well, that there's a connection because the pasuk says, "Lo tochal alav chametz shivat yamim tochal alav matzot." Right? Don't eat chametz for 7 days. Eat matzah, and we've quoted this already before. But there's a clear connection between those two prohibitions. That there's a prohibition of chametz and there's a mitzvah of matzah. And we're going to say that really for something to be included in the category of matzah, it has to also, on the flip side, if it was leavened, be included in the category of chametz. Says the Mishnah, Elu dvarim shadam yotzei b'hem yedei chovato b'Pesach. These are the things that you can use for your mitzvah of eating matzah on Pesach. Rashi understands, as do I think the Rishonim I saw, that this refers to the specific mitzvah of eating matzah on the night of the Seder. So it says, Be'erev tochlu matzot, right? It's a mitzvah taseh, we make a bracha, to eat matzah. That's what we're referring to here. These are the things you can use. Chitin, which we usually translate as wheat. I don't know what wheat is exactly, but I know you buy it in the store. Seorin, which translates as barley. I wouldn't recognize either of these things if I saw them not in a bag, right? But other people in this room might. Kusmin, so here it gets very complicated what these things are. Generally, I grew up translating this as spelt. Rashi says spelt here. Shipon, which traditionally is translated as rye, and shibolet shual, which is traditionally translated as oats, right? So those are the 5 grains, so to speak. Wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. Now, I was reading just before Daf Yomi an article from Rabbi Linzer, which might have been from 7 years ago, about some of the more modern discussions about what these things really are. We're going to learn the Gemara about it, but the Gemara has no help because the Gemara just translates each one into an Aramaic word. Right? It gets nothing closer to what the description is. And Rabbi Linzer quotes from many sources, including Wikipedia, and to describe that probably kusmin is farro, actually, as the Gemara, which is interesting because the Gemara is going to say that farro is that kusmin is a type of wheat, right? And he says farro is like wheat. Again, I don't really know what that means. And shipon he quotes some people, and I'm happy to send the article, but he quotes shipon to probably be spelt, right? Which is, but we have kusmin, that for shipon, and then shibolet shual is the real controversy. So, I translate it as oats. Of course, oats, and that's very, very helpful for people who are gluten-free, right? Because oats don't have gluten in them. And so unlike the other four, they don't have gluten. And so if you can use oats for your matzah, then even if you're gluten-free, you can get oat matzah and be yotze your mitzvah matzah, which sounds like a really good option. The problem is that there are many who say that because it has no gluten, it shouldn't be in the category of grain, because everything else, all the other grains that we exclude are gluten dependent. And so maybe that's really a determining factor. And they come up with a different explanation, shibolot shuel, to mean some kind of other barley, in which case oats would not count for matzah. But obviously, if someone is gluten-free, that's a very challenging situation because then what do they eat? But anyways, these are the 5 grains in our Mishnah. And it continues the Mishnah, and this is a language that we've had many, many times. Yotzin b'dmai, you can be yotzei your mitzvah of matzah, eating matzah that's made out of dmai. Remember, dmai is grain that you bought from someone who is an am haaretz, so you don't know if they took truma and maaser. They probably did, but they might not have, and the Chazal required you to take it again. Let's say you haven't taken it again. You can use that for your matzah. We'll see in the Gemara whether it's b'diavad or l'chatchila. U'maaser rishon shenitla trumato. If you have maaser rishon that you took off the truma, remember the way you would have grain, you would first take off truma gedolah, which goes to the kohen. Then you would take off 10% for maaser that goes to the Levi. The Levi then has to take off trumat maaser, which is 10% of the maaser that they get. Right? So let's say the Levi has maaser. Remember, maaser can be eaten by anybody. It's just owned by the Levi, but he can give it to his neighbor, the Jew, if he wants to, or he can sell it to you. If you took off truma, then you can do it. The Gemara is going to ask, it's obvious. Maaser sheni v'hekdesh, which remember our growth through maaser sheni is the next 10% in maaser sheni years, which you have to eat in Yerushalayim. If you don't live in Yerushalayim or you're not hungry that day, you can always exchange it for money. And use the money in Yerushalayim, right? So then the maaser sheni goes on the money, the grain becomes nothing, right? Chulin, basically. And then you can use that. Gemara is going to, of course, ask Pshita. V'kohanim v'chalo b'truma. And kohanim who can eat challah and truma, if they take their challah and truma that they got and they bake it into matzah, they can use that for Leil Seder, even though a Yisrael couldn't eat it, right? So that's what the Gemara is going to conclude. Avalo b'tevel. But if you use grain that's tevel, meaning you have not taken off truma yet, you bake it into matzah, you can't eat that matzah. And if you do, you're not yotzei your mitzvah of matzah. The lo b'maaser rishon shelo netot trumato, and not with maaser rishon, which you didn't take truma, meaning the Levi didn't take off the truma. The lo b'maaser sheni v'hekdesh shelo niftu. And again, the Gemara is going to go through this. We've done this many, many times. We did it by eruv, we do it by menachot, and we're going to talk about what the chiddush is. Chalot hatodah. Now, if let's say you have to bring a carbon toda, and you set aside grain and you bake chalot to bring to the Beit HaMikdash to bring with your carbon toda, right? Now, remember, many of those chalot were matzah. So you take those and you decide you're not going to use them for your toda, you're going to use them for your seder, right? Because Pesach is coming. Or rikikei nazir, same thing. You're a nazir, you make these cakes, which are matzah. Asan la'atzman, if you make them for yourself to use for your carbon, then ein yotzei b'hen. Even if you end up not using them for your carbon, but you still can't use them for your seder, for Pesach. But asan l'mkar b'shuk, if you run a business, right, where you make chalot, you run a bakery, where people buy your chalot for them to bring carbon toda, and you didn't sell them today, and you have extra, you can use them, yotzei b'hen, you can then use them. And again, the Gemara is going to discuss all the considerations.
There were like Korban Toda stores?
Of course, yeah. I mean, how else? You need 40 loaves, right?
Yeah, right. So that was a bakery.
Yeah. So
they're big business. They're catering, like you're offering a Toda.
I'm sure that the guys down the road were 5 cents cheaper.
Yeah.
You think Jews figured out wholesale and retail in the 20th century, Hanan?
No, I'm not saying that, but okay.
Okay, says the Gemara. Let's talk about these grains. Tana, kusmin, which I translated as spelt, but I told you that Rabbi Linzer and many others say that it's probably farro, is min chitin. It's a type of grain, which apparently farro is a type of grain, but again, I eat farro, but I don't know what it is. Shibolet shuel v'shifon, which again, I translate as rye and oats, but some translate differently. Those are min so'orim. Those are in the family of so'orim. Rashi explains that that's in regards to truma. Remember, you're only, or maaser, let's say, you can only take off maaser on one min for the same min, right? Meaning, let's say you have 100 apples. You can take off some of the apples, you can't take them off for your oranges that are next door. So if you have a sack of wheat and a sack of barley, you can't take maaser from the wheat for the barley, right? but you can, according to this Gemara, take off from the wheat for the kusmin, because it's a type of wheat, right? So it's in the family of wheats. What are they? Says the Gemara, the first wide line. Kusmin is golba. If that helps anyone, but that's what kusmin means. It's golba. Rashi says ispelita, which is spelt, which is where the traditional explanation is spelt. As I just told you, if you say that this is farro, then Rashi's wrong. Shifon is dishra, which again, I don't have any more insight, but our traditional explanation is rye. And shibolet shuel just means shivila tala, which doesn't tell you anything. Shual just means a tal, right? Aramaic for shual, for a fox, is ta'al. So it just tells you it's like a fox. You know, we shouldn't say that the grains look like a fox's tail. I don't know, again, what about them would look that way? I don't know what a fox's tail looks like either. Anyways, says the point is, hani in, these are the only things you can use for the matzah. What's excluded by giving us this list? Orez v'dochen lo. Things like rice and millet, which are cereals. I don't know what rice is exactly, but millet is a cereal. I had to Google that one, right? Those things are not kosher for matzah, meaning if you take millet flour, which apparently is very popular in the third world, as I discovered on Wikipedia, or you take rice, which is popular in many worlds, and you make it into flour, and then you add water and you bake cakes. You cannot be yotzei matzah with that. Says Gemara Minani Mili. How do we know this? Amar Reb Shimon ben Lakish v'chein tana d'vei Reb Yishmael v'chein tana d'vei Reb Eliezer ben Yaakov. Amar Kra. This is the most important pasuk for today's daf. It says, Lo tochal alav chametz shivat yamim tochal alav matzah, right? Matzot. Connecting the prohibition of not eating chametz to the mitzvah, the positive mitzvah of eating matzah, telling you, says the Braita, dvarim habaim lidei chimutz, things that lead to, I don't know, chimutz, leavening, or things that lead to leavening or rising maybe, adam yotzei behem midei chovato b'matzah. If you mixed it inappropriately, you let it sit for too long, or you heated it up too much, it would rise. Then if you don't do that and you just bake it quickly, it becomes matzah. But yatsu elu she'ein ba'im lidei chimutz, these things which don't become chimutz, they don't rise. Again, rise doesn't necessarily mean size, but it means that they don't have value added by the chemical reaction that happens, which is why many of the achronim understand this means gluten. That gluten is the mainstay here, which is the question with oats. But either way, things that don't lead to chimutz, ella lidei sirachon. These are considered to be fermented or sirach literally means to, I guess, get moldy or bad. But like when they rot, so to speak, right? So, or partially, meaning that there are still chemical reactions, of course, that happen between rice and millet and water, but it's not the same as chimutz. And again, how you define that and practically whether gluten-free can fit into that category, right, is the big halachic question. Can you have gluten-free things that count as matzah? And again, according to our traditional translation, oats fit into that category. Anyways, matnit and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. This goes against the opinion of the Tana Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. The Amar, what did Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri say? Orez min daganu. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri felt that orez, rice, is a type of grain. The chayavin al chimutzo karet. And in fact, if you put your rice flour and you let it sit with water and it rises, you'd be chayav karet if you ate the product of that, if you ate the rice cakes, the rice patties. The Tanya, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri oser ba'orez v'dochen. It's not so clear what this braita is talking about, but let's just say it's talking about chametz. Rashi likes. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri prohibited you to make chametz, to mix on Pesach orez and dochen, rice and millet. Nipnei shekarov la'chametz, because they are close to getting chametz. Now it says, what does that mean? They're close to getting chametz. Does that mean shekarov la'chametz, meaning that they very easily become chametz, the kadimu machmitz, that very quickly they'll become chametz? So unlike grain, right, there's no prohibition in making matzah on Pesach. We don't do it, right, because we don't bake our own matzah. But you could take flour, mix it with water on Pesach, and then you just have to bake it within 18 minutes, right? And it's not prohibited. But maybe that's because it takes time for it to become chametz. These become chametz very quickly. Odilmar, maybe what Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri meant was karov lachametz, meaning they're similar to chametz, right? Have, but chametz gamor lo have. That these are not exactly chametz gamor, right? Because they don't have gluten, let's say, they're not rising, but they're similar to chametz, and therefore I prohibit it. So maybe we don't know if Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri meant that it's really midoraita chametz or it's just a gzera midrabanan. Tashma, let's prove it from the following braita. The Tanya, Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Orez min daganhu. It's a type of grain. V'chayavin al chimutzo karet. So it very clearly says that you're chayav for eating it if it's chametz for karet. So he clearly holds that it's absolutely chametz 100%. The adam yotzei bo yidei chavato b'Pesach, and you can turn it into matzah, and you can have rice matzah and be yotzei the mitzvah of matzah with that. So that's another solution if you're gluten-free. Unfortunately, we don't paskin this way, obviously, right? But in theory, you can use it. What?
Even the Sephardim who eat rice don't say that you could be outside.
Right, because it's not a min dagan, right? It's not one of the 5 grains, according to the traditional opinion. V'chein ayu Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer karmit chayevet b'chala. He said karmit was chayev b'chala because it's a grain. It says where my karmit. Rabbi, it's shitznita. Does that help anyone? Rashi says it's ketzach. I mean, does anyone have an English translation of what this is? I don't really know what that is. Ketzach. That's a Hebrew word. Ask the Gemara, my shitznita. Like the Gemara didn't know what shitznita was either. Amar Papa, it's shitznita. It's this plant, the mishtaka beni kalnita. It grows between the kalnita. Kalnita is poppies, right? I think kalnita is poppies, right? Kalnitas. So it grows. It's this grain or the seed. I don't know. Maybe a grass that grows in between the flowers and is also a type of grain, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, but presumably not according to anybody else who disagrees with that. Fine. So says Rabbi Bar Bachana and Rish Lakish. Let's get to the next halacha, which is very, very relevant to us today. We will discuss it much more tomorrow, but we're going to get a hint of it here. Says Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Rabbi Bar Bachana, sorry, Rish Lakish, Isa shenilosha biyayin b'shemen udvash. Let's say now, this is the language here is very, very tricky because the way I might have read it is Isa, which literally translates as a dough, right? That you kneaded with wine, oil, or honey, meaning not water. Now Rashi does not agree with that explanation. And Rashi says it means flour, not Isa, not a dough, but you take wheat, right? You take flour and you mix it with wine, or you mix it with honey or oil, right? Meaning non-water. But Rashi understands there's no water involved in this at all. Not all the other Rishonim, maybe most of the other Rishonim disagree and say there's water and the other thing. But Rashi understands it just means you're mixing your flour with liquid that's not water, right? So ein chayavin alav al chimutzo karet. Says Rish Lakish, if that becomes chametz, meaning it rises and it turns into dough and bread and you bake pancakes out of it, you're not chayav for that. And I presume you did this, right? You mix flour and oil and mix them together and fry it. That's not considered to be chametz, to be chayav karet. Now again, the language here seems to be pretty obvious that you're not chayav karet, but that it's prohibited, right? But I'll just point out to you that Rabbi Notam says that's not the case, that it's permitted completely, okay? And again, we're gonna get into this sugya later because Gemara's tomorrow and in a few days that talk about this, but it's not regular chametz, okay? So again, you're mixing flour with something that's not water. Well, we don't say that here. Yayin, shem, and dvash, wine, oil, honey, it's not chiyuv chametz to be chayav karet. Now, why not? So Yativ Rav Papa, Rav Huna Bar Yeshua, Rav Papa and his friend Rav Huna Bar Yeshua were sitting one Shabbat afternoon maybe, and they were sitting Kamei of Idi Bar Avin. They were sitting in front of the teacher, Rav Idi Bar Avin. And the Yativ Rav Idi Bar Avin become a namning. Idi Bar Avin had just had, a big lunch, and he was dozing off in his chair. He was napping. Amrle, Rav Huna Bar Yeshua, Rav Papa. So these two Talmidim said to each other, they weren't Talmidim necessarily, but they weren't young, but they were Talmidim of Rav Idi Bar Avin. But they said to each other, Rav Huna said to Rav Papa, my time of the Reish Lakish. Why does Reish Lakish say that if you mix your dough, your flour, with yayin, shemen, and dvash, you're not chayav for chametz? So Amarle, so Rav Papa responded, to Amarkra, because the pasuk we've quoted earlier today, Lo tochal alav chametz, shivat yomim tochal alav matzah. You connect chametz to matzah, and what he was telling us is dvarim she'adam yotzei b'hem yidei chavato b'matzah, anything you can use for your mitzvah of matzah, chayavin alav al chimutzo karet. Now, we quoted this earlier to say that something that's not a grain that you can make into chametz, right, that doesn't rise, you can't use for matzah. But Rav Papa is taking this a step further. He's saying, forget about the grains. anything that you can't use for your mitzvah of matzah doesn't become chametz. And these, says the Gemara, since if you made flour and oil together and you baked it in a cake, you would not be yotzei your mitzvah of matzah. Why wouldn't you be yotzei your mitzvah of matzah? How do we know that? Says the Gemara, Zahavile matzah ashira. Not because it's not grain, not because of leaven, but because there's a whole separate halacha, which we're going to get to in 2 months, right, in the end of the Masechet, that matzah is called lechem oni. It's lechem that is for poor people. And so if you put things that are rich, like wine or oil or sugar, into your matzah, you're not yotzei your mitzvah of matzah, because it's called matzah ashira. So now, again, this is taking this halacha into a whole new way. Right? It's not saying that grains that are chametz become grains that are matzah. It's saying anything that you can't use for matzah, because here it's not lechem oni, doesn't ever make chametz, which is a huge leap, right? So since this is matzah ashira, ein chayavin al chimutzo karet. Said Rav Huna Bar Yeshua back to Rav Papa. Rav Huna Bar Yeshua Rav Papa. I don't get it. Is it really true that there's a direct connection between those things? What about the following Breita? The Breita says, let's say you take your matzah, and again, this is also very practical for people who don't have teeth or can't swallow easily, right? So let's say, which I think was a bigger problem in olden times maybe, but let's say you take your matzah and this person can't chew it, right? For whatever reason, they whatever. So you soak it in water until it totally dissolves, basically, and it's like a gummy paste, right? And then they just swallow it. So says the Breita, you let it, mecheu means, to melt, essentially, right? It becomes, congealed, essentially. Vigamo, and then you swallow it. So you take a piece of chametz, let's say, and it just becomes, you make it down to a way where you can just swallow it that way. It's like liquid almost, or like a paste. Im chametzu anush kares. If it's chametz, you are chayiv karet because you ate it, right? But if im matzahu ein adam yotzei ba'yidei chavato b'pesach. If it's Pesach, you're not yotzei. Why aren't you yotzei? Because you have to have derech achila. And this is not the way people eat, right? People eat by chewing and swallowing, and you're just throwing this down. And so you see clearly in this Breita that it can be an isser of chametz and you are not yotzei matzah, that these things are not always connected. Ha-ha-ha, says the Gemara.
How are you over on the isser if you're not eating it?
So it's an isser. So it's a good question, but basically that you are eating it in the sense that you're getting nourishment from it, you're getting benefit from it, but it's not derech achilato. It's not the way people eat, right? So we're going to learn later that you're not yotzei mitzvah of matzah because you have to have achila by matzah, but by chametz it doesn't say necessarily achila. It's any way of getting benefit from it. And so since you're getting nourishment, you're getting calories, you're consuming it, you'd be over the isser of chametz, but not yotzei the mitzvah of matzah.
You might be over on like hana, basically.
Over on what?
The
Hachana, is that what you're saying?
hana, yeah.
Hana.
Yeah.
Benefit. Yeah, I mean, we'll see. It's not really just limited to that because the truth is that it's also considered to be a way of eating. It's just not derech achilato, meaning it's an alternative way of eating. But Rashi understands here that you'd be over for the issue of eating, just you're not be yotzei the mitzvah of matzah. But clearly you see that it doesn't fit, right? So your whole paradigm that you can't have one without the other doesn't hold up. You couldn't eat matzah this way. Now, so they're going back and forth trying to figure this out. And of course, the Rebbe wakes up. Vidi Bar Avin woke up. He was listening, in a dream state to their conversation. And Amrlu, he said to them, Dartiki, which is a endearing term for like these kids or young people, young ones. Rashi says bachurim. Rashi says it's diminutive. It's like you immature ones. L'hainu taima d'Reish Lakish. This is what's the question?
No, I just can't find the Rashi.
Because it's in Shabbos on Daf Kuf Mem Hey.
Oh, okay.
Ayin Sham. I'm a bet. My Gemara has it, but I have extra Rashis here.
Okay.
So Dartiki, Hainu Taima de Reish Lakish, this is the reason of Reish Lakish, Mishum, the Havile Mei Peirot, because Yayin, Shem, and Dvash is considered not obviously, but it's considered liquid of juice of Peirot, Mei Peirot in Machmitzim. And Mei Peirot are not Machmitzim, which is where Tosfot here says, or Rabbeinu Tam says, that therefore what Reish Lakish was saying is that it's not chametz at all. Now remember, Reish Lakish said you're not chayiv karet, which implies you're not chayiv karet, but it's an isser. But here we're saying it's not chametz at all, and that's how Rabbeinu Tam paskins. He quotes, Tosfos quotes different opinions in this, which have a lot of practical relevance, right? If you're baking on Pesach and you mix flour and oil, you're making pancakes. What's the status of those? Anyways, tomorrow's daf actually deals with this much more deeply, so we'll get to this tomorrow. But here is where Tosfos, the very, very important and famous Tosfos, quotes what happens with what's something that's not mei perot and not water, as we call it, mei beitzim, or eggs, right? So what if you take eggs? What category are they in, right? If you take your flour and you mix it with eggs, which I think people do when they make cake all the time, right, and add no water in, make brownies or whatever, is that considered to be chametz or not chametz? Is it matzah or not matzah? And this, of course, is very practical.
It's egg matzah.
Egg matzah, very good, exactly. And so this is where Tosfos quotes the last few words in this Tosfos on Amud Bet. Now Rabbeinu Tam used to say it wasn't chametz or matzah really, and on Erev Pesach, Rabbeinu Tam would eat it all day long, right? He would eat flour mixed with eggs, egg matzah, because you're not allowed to eat chametz. Remember, you're not allowed to eat matzah on Erev Pesach. You also can't eat chametz on Erev Pesach, right? So we always struggle with what do you eat. I guess it was before they invented potato kugel, right? But back in the day, people struggled with what do you eat?
Or fruit or vegetables.
Oh boy.
Or cheese.
All these options. Anyway, but we're gonna get tomorrow's daf. Actually, we'll go to this in more detail. Continues the Gemara. Back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that you could be yotzei with demai and with maaser sheni, maaser rishon sheniftet. Says the Gemara, why? How can you use demai? How can you use demai for matzah? Halo chazilei. You can't eat demai, right? The Rabbanan said you're not allowed to eat demai. You have to take off truma and maaser. Says the Gemara. Well, this answer, which we've given many times before, is that although you can't eat demai, kivan di'iboi mafkir l'nichsei. If you needed to, you can always, remember, demai is an Isser Drabanan, because we assume that most Amaratzim take off Truma and Maser. It's just that some don't. So, in Drabanan, you have to take it off again. But remember that they didn't make the Gzeirah when you were in difficult situation. If you're a poor person, if you're an ani, you don't have good access to food, then you're allowed to eat demai without taking off more Truma and Maser. And so since everyone is one step away from being an ani, right? Because you can always just give up all your possessions and you have nothing left, right? So since kivan di'iboi mafkir l'nichsei, you can give up. You can just say, I give up. I don't know how you say it. I give up.
Renounce.
Renounce, thank you. I was looking for an R word there. I renounce all my possessions. You'll be an ani, and then you can be ochel demai. So hashtanami, even though you didn't do that, chazilei, it's considered to be suitable for you, at least be diavad. It's not, as we said in the Mishnah, machilin et ha'aniyim demai, vet achsanya demai. If you're an ani, you can eat demai. If you're an achsanya, if you're a traveler, Rashi always says that achsanya were these Jewish soldiers who would visit the town and be put up in homes of people, and they were traveling. They had no money. They didn't bring provisions with them, so they were considered poor people. Tosfos understands usually that it's non-Jewish people, and that's the permission. But anyways, someone who is poor or traveling maybe, and doesn't have good access to food, can eat demai, even lechatchila. The Amar Rav Huna, and as Rav Huna said, it's in fact a machloket Tanaim. Tana Beit Shammai omrim ein machilin et aniyim et achsanya demai, but Beit Hillel omrim machilin. And therefore, well, here's where the therefore gets into very tricky. So therefore, Tosfos says, presumably it means that since you really are suitable to eat demai if you were poor, even if you're not poor and you eat the demai, b'diavad, you'll be yotzei, because it's not such a significant isur.
Okay, I don't understand why you wouldn't be yotzei even if you ate, you didn't do truma, you ate it. You'd be over on the mitzvah of not giving truma, but it's still bread.
So I'll tell you what Rashi says. There's two answers to the question. I'm going to give you the one Rashi says, which is not entirely convincing. Rashi quotes the Gemara later today. We'll get there. that this same pasuk of Shivat Yamim, what's the pasuk? Shivat Yamim, sorry, I lost. Lo tuchal alav chametz Shivat Yamim tuchal alav matzot, is one way to understand the pasuk is you shouldn't eat them because it's chametz, you should eat it because it's matzah. That only things that if you wanted to eat it, if it was chametz, would be prohibited because it's chametz, can become matzah. But something that you couldn't eat it because it's demai, or because it's tevel, or because it's tameh or something, that cannot become matzah. So you can only make something matzah, which that's how you understand the pasuk. The Gemara is going to quote it. So before you frown, Ravina says this. The challenge with that, and this is what Rashi says in the Mishnah. The challenge with that is that the Gemara is going to come out that Ravina is wrong. So the question is, what does it mean? So Rashi here brings in a second explanation because of that, and he says that it's maybe a mitzvah abba avera, right? That you're doing a mitzvah, you're doing an avera, and therefore you're not yotzei the mitzvah. But anyways, Ravina is going to quote it from a pasuk. Tosfos here, I think this is unbelievable Tosfos. The Ri here in this small Tosfos of Yotzim B'Damai says something fascinating, and he says that in fact you might be yotzei with Damai even lechatchila, because says the Ri, again I think it's incredible Ri, says because on the night of the Seder everybody is in the mindset of being a poor person. You're eating lechem oni and you're suffering and you're like going out of Egypt. You become an ani for that night. And so even lechatchila you can eat demai, which is a fascinating comment both on the Seder and on the halacha, that you become an ani basically, because that's the mind, that's the Seder, and therefore on Seder night everyone can eat demai. So it's really a great beautiful statement. He says he's not sure if it's true, but he thinks about it.
And it's only
Anyway,
for
so
the Seder, not for the rest of Pesach.
Well, so the rest of Pesach, right? So the truth is not for the rest of the Pesach, but we're not actually talking about the rest of Pesach, because the mitzvah of achilat matzah really is a separate mitzvah of the first night. But the mitzvah of eating matzah the first night is not the same as eating matzah the rest of the Pesach, as we talked about last week. But we'll get to this more. Tomorrow we're going to discuss this as well. So this is all based on the mitzvah of be'erev tochlu matzah, that you have to eat matzah that night, which is the Seder night. Okay. Anyways, continues the Gemara, and this sugya will be familiar to anyone who's learned Daf Yomi because we quote it many times. Maaser rishon shenitla trumato. If you take maaser rishon and you take off truma, you can eat it for Pesach. This is more pshita, of course. Kivan shenatla trumato chulin havi, right? Once you take the grain and you take off the truma, remember, this is grain where you gave it to the Levi, so it's maaser. The Levi cannot eat the maaser until he takes off or she takes off trumat maaser. Once you do that, it's chulin. It's like regular grain. It says, where you went when it was still, remember, you took your grain, it would be shibolim are the stacks, right? You just cut it down, and then you would take it and you would make it into a kri, into a pile. What's it called?
Kadish, I don't know.
Bale.
Haystack. That's what I'm looking for, right? But it's not exactly a haystack because you need the grain, of course, right? But you would pile it together, right? You would bundle them together. And so it's talking about where you took off maaser before you made them into the bundles. And so what you did was you didn't give any portion to the Kohen. You just went, and you gave portion, right? So let's say you gathered together your grain, you had a small bundle together, not the big bundles, but the small one, and you gave a portion to the Levi directly. And the Levi then gave a portion of that to the Kohen. But you never did the original truma, which is what we call truma gedola, right? So you just gave it to the Levi gave their portion to the Kohen. That is okay, and that's the chiddush. You were makdim, meaning you gave it to the Levi earlier than the Kohen. You didn't give it to the Kohen ever. When it was in the shibolim, in the stalks. And the Levi was natla himenu trumat maaser, but you never took off natla himenu truma gedola. You never took off the original truma, and that's okay. Kedar Rabbi Avo. Yamri Rabbi Avo, Rabbi Shimon Lakish. Maaser rishon. If you're talking about maaser rishon, sheikdimo b'shibolim, you give it to the Levi when it's still in the sheaves, not stacked together. Patur mi truma gedola. You never have to give truma gedola to eat this grain. Shenemar, it's based on the pasuk. The pasuk says, "Harimotem mimenu trumat Hashem," that the Levi, once he gets his maaser, he has to take off trumat Hashem, maaser min hamaaser, a tenth from his maaser that he got. But says Reish Lakish, maaser min hamaaser amarti lecha. You take off a tenth, the low truma gedola, trumat maaser min hamaaser. You don't have to take off both trumot, the truma that the Yisrael never took, and the Trumat Maaser. Amalei Rav Papa Abaya says Rav Papa Abaya El Me'ata. I don't get it. If that's true and you're reading the pasuk that way, then I feel like imo b'kri nami lipater. And even if once you made it into a kri is the bundle, right? The big stack. Again, I don't know what it's called, but a kri is a big stack of grain together. Even then, once, which is a later stage, even if you then did the inappropriate thing and gave it to a Levi before giving it to a Kohen, then why don't you apply the pasuk as well, that the Levi only has to give Trumat Maaser, but not Truma Gedola. So why don't you say that in the same case as well? Amalei, so Abaye said back to Rav Papa, Alecha Amar Kra, there's another verse. The verse says, talking about a Levi here, Mikol matmechem charimo et kol trumat Hashem. From your gifts, you have to give all the trumot of Hashem, and that's referring to both truma of Truma Gedola and Trumat Maaser. So back in Mari'ita, how do you see that? Meaning, you have one pasuk which says you take off one truma, and one pasuk which says you take off two trumot. How do you know which one applies to which situation? And he answered, Hai idgan, hai lo idgan. When you talk about the concept of dagan, right? Dagan means grain to us, but it also means gathered together. And so when something is gathered together, then is where you take off. It says by truma, right, that you get truma on all your dagan, right? Your dagan. And so therefore, once it's gathered together in the pile, that's where the chiyuv of truma always applies. And even if you incorrectly give it to a Levi before taking the truma, the Levi has to take off that truma before he can eat it. But if you gave it to the Levi when it was still in the piles, right, in the what's called the stalks, the shibolim, then the Levi does not have to give truma gedolah before he eats it. He only has to give trumat maaser, and that's the chiddush of our Mishnah. This is the principle that our Mishnah is teaching us.
Just for review, who does a Levi give Trumat Gedolah to?
To a Kohen. So when you have grain, I'm a Yisrael, I have to give a portion to the Kohen. Then I give a portion to the Levi. The Levi has to give a portion of his thing to the Kohen before he can eat it.
The Kohen gets twice.
The Kohen gets twice. But for me, let's say the Yisrael, he gets, let's say 1/50th, which will be 2%. From the Levi, he gets 10% of 10%, right, which is 1%, for those who can do math. Okay, so yes, the Kohen gets twice. Double dipping. Continues the Gemara, the Mishnah said, Maaser Sheni, the Hektish Sheniftu. Right, you were podeh, your Maaser Sheni, you can use it for matzah. Says where Pasha, of course, why not? Pshita. Remember that when you redeem your Maaser, you don't just give the value, you have to give the value plus a fifth, which means a quarter, right? But a 25% extra. And so by giving 25% extra, you have to do that. But let's say you didn't. Let's say your grain was worth $100 and you only had $100. And you said, I want the value of this grain to go onto this money, right? But you didn't do the chumash. So you might have thought, Kamash Malan, chumash ma'akev. It's telling you that even though you didn't do it, you have to do it. The chumash is not ma'akev, and the kedusha goes off of the grain, and you can then use the grain for anything you want to do, including for making your matzah.
So that's a mitzvah sheba l'idei avera, right? I mean, you did not complete you did an avera, you didn't give the chomesh.
So I'm not sure it's an avera, it's a requirement. This is not a question of avera, it's a question, the grain that you ate does not have kedusha, you have a chiyuv to give the extra 25%.
And you didn't do it.
But that's not in the grain. I mean, the grain is regular grain.
Yeah, but you sin through.
No, well, you might do it later. I mean, you didn't run out the clock yet.
Wow.
Right. HaKohanim b'chalo b'truma. So Kohanim can use chal and truma pshita. Why not? It says, "Where matzah shaveh l'chol adam be'inan." I might think that, and it's going to be tomorrow's daf, that you need matzah that is accessible to everyone, meaning a Kohen can't eat matzah that a Yisrael next to him couldn't eat. Kamashman, as we're going to say tomorrow, matzot riba. There's an extra word matzah to tell you there's different types of matzah. Matzah for an individual and matzah that applies for everybody, but meaning a Kohen can use matzah that is only accessible to that Kohen. Says the Mishnah, avalo b'tevel. But you can't use grain that's tevel, that hasn't had truma taken from it. So pshita, of course not. You can't eat it. Lo tzricha b'tevel tavo midrabanan. We're talking about tevel midrabanan. What's the example of tevel midrabanan? Shezaro ba'atzitz sheinu nakuv. You planted your peaches in a pot that did not have a hole in it, right? In a flower, in a big pot. And then it's not really growing from the ground. You're not chayav midoraita and taking tevel. Chazal said, well, it looks like a peach, it smells like a peach. You should take tevel from it, but it's not midoraita, and therefore you might have thought, therefore, since it's only drabanan, you can use it. Kamashman, that you can't, and you're not yotzei your mitzvah. The next case was you can't use maser rishon that you didn't take off truma gedola. Similar pshita. Of course, that should be obvious too. You can't eat it. Lo tzricha. No, it's talking about a case where you did take off truma. It didn't mean you didn't take off truma. It meant you didn't take off truma gedola, which is the case where hiktimo bikri. You gave it to the Levi in the kri, meaning after you already made the pile. And the Levi took off Truma Gdola and gave it to the Kohen, but the Levi took off Trumat Ma'aser and gave it to the Kohen, but the Levi never took off Truma Gdola, right? You never took off the initial Truma that you give to the Kohen. And we just said before that if you do that in Shibolin, that's okay. But if you do it once it's become Kri, it's not okay. And Ma'adatema, you might have thought, Kedam Leir Papa Abaya, remember if Papa asked Abaya 20 lines ago, maybe the halacha should be true about both situations. Kamashmalan, Kedishani, like Abaya answered that no, it depends on whether it's a pile or not a pile. And so if you did it when it's already a kri, it's not edible. You can't do it because you have to take off two types of truma. And if you didn't, you can't use it for matzah. If you did it when it was not in the pile yet, that would be okay. And continued the Gemara, the Mishnah, says Pshita, of course. If you didn't redeem your Maser Sheni or Hektish, you can't use it. So if you can't use it, you can't make it into matzah. No, you missed it. The Olam the Niftu. We're talking about a case where you were redeemed it, but you just didn't redeem it properly. My lo niftu, shlo niftu kehel chatan. For example, Maser Sheni shepado gabi asimon. You exchanged your Maser Sheni for a block of metal, which is not the same block of metal, but a coin that is not a stamped coin. It's just a regular piece of metal that has certain value. And we learn in the Braita, Drachamana Amar, Vitsarta akesef, which literally means you wrap up the kesef and you carry it. But the word tsarta implies davar sheyesh lo tsura. It has to be minted coin, right? It has to have a face or an object or something, an eagle or a name or whatever, a king. But you have to do it onto coins that have a face, a form. And hektish is shechilo gabi karka. Hektish would be, let's say you exchange, right? You donated your car to Hektish, not your car. You donated your crops of tfuah to Hektish, and then you decide, well, I got to need them for matzah. So you say, well, instead of the tfuah going to Hektish, I'll give Hektish my property. So karka. But karka cannot be dedicated to Hektish or cannot be exchanged for Hektish. The pasuk says you give money, and we learn from there it has to be metalton. It has to be something that you can transfer miyad liyad. You can give from one hand to another. And so therefore you did not redeem it properly. The chiddush of the Mishnah is that therefore you can't use it for matzah. Now, Tanur Rabbanan, we're going to get to finally what you've been waiting for all day, right? Tanur Rabbanan, Yachol Yadsei Adam Midei Chovato B'Tevel Shel Nitzkan. Right? Says the Braita, you might think you can do the mitzvah matzah with tevel that was not fixed. What do you mean tevel that was not fixed? Tevel means grain that you didn't take off truma. It's like saying grain that wasn't fixed, that wasn't fixed. Tevel means that. What do you mean? Kol tevel nami halo nitzkan. All tevel is unfixed. Ella, we mean tevel shlo nitzkan kol surko. No, we mean tevel that you started taking off the things you have to give, but you didn't do all of them. For example, you gave primary truma to the Kohen, but lo nitla mimenu trumat maaser. You didn't take off trumat maaser, which is the second level truma, or you didn't take off maaser rishon, or I'm sorry, you did maaser rishon below maaser sheni, or afilo maaser ani minai. Now Rashi points out maaser ani. Remember, in the third and sixth year of a cycle, you have to give the second tenth to the ani. But there's no kedusha associated with that at all. Right? That's not real maaser in the sense that there's nothing special about that. It's just a donation. So even then, minayin Talmud lomar lo tochal alav chametz, and this is the drasha. You can't eat chametz shivat yamim tochal alav matzah. I'm reading the rest of the pasuk, right? 7 days eat matzah. Says the Braita, mi she'isiro mishum bal tochal alav chametz. A grain or a food that you can't eat it if it's chametz, yatzazu, you exclude tevel and maaser and all these things, She'ein isura mishum bal tochal chametz. The reason you can't eat it is not because it's chametz. Ela mishum bal tochal tevel. It's because you're not allowed to eat tevel. And so, therefore, you can't be yotze with matzah because the reason you can't eat it is because it's tevel, not because it's chametz. Because we're 1 second. All the pasuk says is lo tochal of chametz. Isur the chametz lehechad azla. What do you mean you can't eat it because it's tevel? You can't eat it because it's tevel and it's chametz, right? Where did the isur of chametz go? If you take your tevel and you make it into donuts, they're going to be chametz. So what do you mean you can't eat it just because it's tevel? You can't eat it because it's tevel and chametz. Says Rav Sheshet, you're right. Hamani Rabbi Shimoni. Our Mishnah must be this bright. Must be Rabbi Shimon. The Amar Ein Isur Chalal Isur. That you don't have one prohibition falling on another prohibition. Meaning, if you have a donut, right, that's tevel, and Pesach starts, it does not become chametz. Or if you, let me put it this way: if you have grain that's tevel and you make it into bread on Pesach, it won't become asur because chametz, because it's already prohibited. And a second isur of chametz cannot fall on a first isur of tevel. Sounds fascinating. What was the halacha of Rabbi Shimon? The Tanya, Rabbi Shimon Omer, top line of Lamed Vav. Let's say a person wakes up on Yom Kippur morning and he's very hungry and he forgets that it's Yom Kippur and he looks in the fridge, and of course there's no kosher food in the fridge because no one's eating on Yom Kippur. But there's a hamburger, which turns out to be a McDonald's burger, right, sitting in the fridge, which is from the worker, I guess, right? And he takes a bite and eats it by mistake. So a lot of trouble here, right? But says Rabbi Shimon, ha'ochal nevela b'yom kippur, and you eat nevela, which again is an animal, it's not shechted properly, meat from an animal, by mistake on Yom Kippur, patur, you're not chayiv anything. Right? Now, usually if you ate on Yom Kippur, you'd be chayiv a carbon, because it's an isser midoraita. If you do it on purpose, it's an isser of karet, right? So b'shogeg, you bring a carbon chatat. But because this is an isser nevela is not an isser karet, right? You don't bring a carbon for eating non-kosher food by mistake, right? It's nevela. So since it was prohibited because of nevela, the fact that it's also Yom Kippur doesn't add. The isser of nevela is there. Yom Kippur doesn't fall on nevela. So there's no prohibition of eating on Yom Kippur on something that you weren't allowed to eat for another reason. Which is fascinating and crazy, right? Now Rashi says here.
This is all b'shogeg here.
Of course, b'shogeg. Yeah. Now, Rashi points out over here that even if it died on Yom Kippur, it was nevela on Yom Kippur, what about then, right? Because then it wasn't nevela before Yom Kippur. So Rashi says, interestingly, Tosfos doesn't like this so much, that even if it died on Yom Kippur, before an animal dies, you can't eat it because it's Eiver Min HaChai, right? So this meat was already, no matter what it was, when Yom Kippur started, the meat was prohibited to you. And the meat never became permitted to you. And so therefore, since the meat was never permitted to you, the Isser of Yom Kippur can never be chal on the meat. So Rashi says. Tosfos doesn't like it so much, but either way, that's the case. So therefore, this grain is prohibited to you because it's tevel. Even if you make it into chametz, the Isser of chametz does not apply. And since the Isser of chametz does not apply, the mitzvah of matzah cannot apply. That's how the Gemara has to understand. Ravina says, I disagree. And this is what I quoted to you earlier. It doesn't have to be Rabbi Shimon. It could be that what the Braita is saying is Misha Isura Mishum Bal Tochal Chametz Bilvad. Something which the only reason you couldn't eat it if it was chametz is because it's chametz. But Yatzazu Shein Isura Mishum Bal Tochal Chametz Bilvad. The reason you can't eat this grain, which is a donut, is not because it's just chametz. It's Elamish Af Mishum Bal Tochal Tevel. It's also because it's tevel. So that's a really far-fetched answer. Midi bilvad. It doesn't say the word bilvad anywhere. Ela machvarta k'Rav Sheshet. We don't really love this answer, and we go back to Rav Sheshet, which is that our whole Mishnah is going only according to Rabbi Shimon, that ein isur chal isur, and therefore something which is asur from tevel does not become asur from chametz. And since it doesn't have a prohibition of chametz, you can't use it for matzah because chametz and matzah have to be connected. And we will stop here, and tomorrow we will continue this discussion about what you can and cannot use for matzah on Pesach, which is very relevant, of course.
Yeah. Wow.
Shavua Tov, everyone. I hope we can all make it 7:30, bright and early tomorrow morning.
Shavua Tov. Thank you, Eli.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua tov.
What